Okay, I see a red thing that says we're live. So
It looks like we're live. Yes, indeed.
I feel amazing suddenly.
Well, here we are. We are live, and we are. It still says live in 60 seconds on there, but never mind. That maybe it doesn't start going live until the timer counts down on the other thing. Never mind. It doesn't matter whether anyone is listening or not. We are both alive, and we are talking, and that's what really matters, isn't it? Whether anyone listens or not is irrelevant, I think.
And it'll be recorded, so people from the future.
People from the future. This will undoubtedly become what's the word I'm looking for? Not a monument.
A travesty.
Yeah, a travesty. That's some sort of record of intellectual life at this point in the 21st century. What are we actually doing, Pete? Maybe we should explain to people, if they are listening, that we've been having chats frequently, you and I, just for our private interest and amusement. And we thought it was a shame to deprive the wider world of our enlightenment. So we're experimenting with the idea of doing this live, of letting people listen in. If anyone is listening in, could you just type something in the chat to show that that I've got the thing set up right? This is an experiment. This is a pilot.
That could, that could be fake. Maybe you're typing it in.
No. Look, 7 people are watching.
I believe. I keep finding people mentioning the famous philosopher Keith Frankish.
Oh, we're fine.
They're onto something. So, expect that they will come. I also get the impression that there's certain people that consume philosophy content on YouTube that are always on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
They're just waiting for more philosophy content. And, some of them I've kind of become internet friends with. And I don't know their real names, but I know their like handles, and I see them around. And, it's that one tiny little head that I see all the time on Twitter and YouTube. And so
it's quite a strange thing, isn't it? People have an online presence.
Yeah.
Which in some ways can seem more impressive than their actual real life presence. Somehow seeing someone on a screen, seeing someone on a recording, on a video, even though it's just a self-produced thing that only 10 people watch or whatever, it somehow seems to give them, a degree of authority, a degree of presence.
Yeah, that's
just the people you meet just in the office or something don't have.
That's a curious thing about our age.
It is
that because so many of us grew up with movies and television, and prior to the internet, there's still some of us. We haven't all died off. So being on a screen, at least to that generation, that means you're important. You're famous, and it's a really big deal. Like I remember the first time I ever went to LA and saw for the first time these different locations that are super famous, even if you don't know the names of these locations. Like they are in just about everything that's ever filmed in LA. And I had a similar experience the first time I ever went to New York City to see all these things that show up in these TV shows. And it's so weird how simultaneously unimpressive that is. Like these super beautiful and impressive places often look way more beautiful and impressive on the screen because the camera it's like the best camera angle, and it's cropping out like a lot of boring stuff, and when you see it in person, it's simultaneously disappointing but also super impressive. Like I have stepped into real reality, because in some sense that's more important than my mundane quotidian reality, is the reality of celebrities.
Do you think that's all fading now that everybody can be on the screen?
I don't know. We have our own versions of it with like influencers and stuff. There's still fame and virality, and people have this impulse to record and share so much. So we have a slightly different version of, is this what Baudrillard was talking about with hyper reality, where
right,
who knows what French people are ever talking about, but you know, we have multiple conceptions of what counts as real and really real, and they interact with our technologies in really weird ways. But often it's not official until it's recorded somehow, right?
Right.
Video, or it didn't happen. But
well, I mean, when I was young, to be on the screen, you had to be either famous or someone stopped in the street to ask their opinion of a certain brand of butter or something. But you know, it was quite a, you know, if one of your friends got to be on TV, one of my friends when I was at school got to do an advert because they had a great speaking voice or something like this. And, yeah, I think this was amazing. People would rush home to watch. To not to miss this. Always someone got stopped for a vox pop up from the news. You know, you got to watch the news tonight. You will see, you know, Uncle so-and-so being asked what he thinks about the railway strike or something. I don't know. There, I mean, obviously, there still is, I suppose, that status attached to being on the regular, on the mainstream TV channel. But it's all becoming so distributed and so democratic now that maybe it will turn around, and it's actually getting to meet people in person that will be the just seeing them on the screen. I mean, everybody's on the screen these days. Everybody has their 15 minutes of fame, don't they?
Yeah, or maybe 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
15 is a lot. You know, if you look at your analytics on your YouTube videos, you'll see like when people stop watching your video, and on like most of my videos, people stop watching after about 30 seconds. You see this huge drop off, which is very humbling. But that probably adds up. You know, if you get to add these things, maybe you could accumulate 15 minutes that way.
As our listeners, our viewers will notice, we've not got a guest on here. We're just talking, and we've not prepared anything. So we're just doing what we do each week. We're just chatting, and I found these chats very interesting because we're pretty much aligned, I think, on a lot of issues, a lot of philosophical issues. So there's enough disagreement between us to make things interesting. And well, we've been talking a bit, haven't we, about doing a podcast together. It'd be rather different from the one that I did with, well, I still do some episodes with Philip, where we were, Philip Goff, where we were on completely opposite sides of the philosophical landscape. So we were thinking maybe that we would form a different sort of partnership, for which I came up with a wonderfully original and exciting idea. Shall we mention that?
Oh, the Persuaders.
Persuaders, yes. Now, I don't think you know what well, you only know what they are from.
I don't
from hearing me talk about them. The Persuaders. If you were a 10-year-old boy in the early mid-1970s, then you probably remember the Persuaders. It was a comedy action series with Roger Moore and Tony Curtis, and they were playing two playboys. They were both Roger Moore was an English lord, and Tony Curtis was a self-made millionaire, and they both
an American.
Absolutely.
Don't leave out the most important part.
Self-made, and made himself a millionaire on Wall Street. He came from the streets, from the Bronx, or and I don't know. It was all rather cliched. And they were both now playboys. They both got more money than they knew what to do with, and so they were living an idle life. and they are recruited by this retired judge who, in the course of his career as a judge, has observed many cases where criminals have not been brought to justice for their crimes. They've escaped justice. And so he has this idea. Now he's retired. He's going to try and see that these people are brought to justice. They're mostly very sinister criminal types with sort of criminal mastermind. And so he recruits these two playboys to solve these, if you like, these cold cases. Of course, which is, of course, a very reasonable way of enforcing a strategy for law enforcement. And so he sends them off on missions too. And there's lots of sexy girls and things and exotic locations and fast cars. And it's all very much like it's really like a comic book. But I liked this when I was a kid. All very tongue-in-cheek and silly. And so I thought, well, there are quite a lot of cold cases in philosophy that need sorting out. Yes. And there are quite a lot of that is, not in the villainous sense, but in the sense of promoting philosophical errors. And so it'd be good to have a couple of people who were sufficiently aligned to work together despite their differences, and who could try and persuade people to renounce their errors.
So why was the TV show called The Persuaders? Was it because...
That's a good question. I don't know. Because they didn't work by persuading. They tended to work by driving around in fast cars and having sort of choreographed fistfights, and it wasn't exactly that. They didn't rely on argumentation very much.
Well, maybe we could be equally unpersuasive.
I never, no idea what it was called. It had other names in the versions in other language, in the French and German versions. The German version apparently was dubbed by actors who kind of improvised their lines, because the whole thing was tongue in cheek anyway. And so the actors who dubbed it put in lots of extra comic lines of their own. So the whole thing is very, very silly. But yes.
So what are some...
Yep.
First thing that comes to your mind is a philosophical cold case.
Well,
it is escaped. We need to roll up our sleeves and fix it ASAP.
Well, I mean, the one we're always talking about, of course, is
the C word.
Yes, of course. And I think I think that the roots of this, actually, you'll find very few people, I guess, these days who will say they believe in sense data, right?
Right.
Because sense data, there's all sorts of problems with that, and a good sort of hatchet job was done on them by people like Austin and so on. So I don't think you get many people confessing, well, you had Frank Jackson in the 1970s, robust defense of sense data. I'm sure there are people who believe in it. But most people say, well, we know we don't believe in that. We're happy to be direct realists. But of course, there are still these qualitative properties that are hanging around when you're perceiving. So you're perceiving things in the world. Okay, you're representing the world. But there are these mental qualities that are hanging around while you do that, even if they're not themselves playing an intermediate representational role. Maybe they're sort of adding something to the representation of the world, but they're not actually necessary to do the basic perceptual work, because you could have a zombie that could perceive stuff and so on without them. But I'm not sure that they really have got rid of sense data, because when you ask them how we know about these qualities, they tend to talk about them as things that are known in a very special way, that we have a very special epistemic relation to, a very direct relation to, which is quite different from our relation to the properties of things in the external world. So now maybe we're not inferring the presence of stuff in the world from our knowledge of those things, but still we have this two-stage epistemic picture where there's stuff that we really know, which is part of our the furniture of our private mental worlds, and then there's other stuff that we know, maybe not from influence from that, but in some more indirect way, and that's still, I think, a very sense data-ish kind of picture.
Yeah, it's hard to pin down because, well, for many reasons, but one that pops into my mind is that you've got professional philosophers or people that are, they're getting paid to teach this stuff and publish on it. So we'll just call those the professionals. Mm-hmm. But other people that are helping keep this whole thing aloft are let's call them the non-professionals. Mm-hmm. And, if it wasn't for the non-professionals, the professionals would just be some weird guys in someone's garage who maybe they get together every so often, or, maybe the internet will allow them to do that a little bit more easily. But really, what's holding the professional conversation aloft is that it's being consumed to some degree by people that are either taking classes or just picking up on this, and when it makes it into the popular press. Lots of people who aren't professionals have heard of David Chalmers and the hard problem of consciousness. That stuff got into Scientific American magazine and really has had quite a popular impact. And you and I both try to be public-facing professional philosophers to some degree and hang out on social media. And my experience is often the case, people who are non-professionals and really believe that there is a hard problem, believe that ultimately science can't deliver a theory of consciousness. They seem to be motivated by what looks kind of like what I would think of as old-fashioned sense data theory. And when they spell out what's motivating them, a lot of what they will say sounds like, maybe they won't put it in these words, but they buy into some kind of foundationalist epistemology, mm-hmm. whereby we do have empirical knowledge. The empirical knowledge has to be justified somehow. Mm-hmm. And they are attracted to this kind of foundationalist picture whereby there are these self-justifying justifiers, mm-hmm. which also happen to be these simple sensory ideas. Mm-hmm. And, so they've picked up a lot of stuff, some of it by osmosis, some of it they don't know that they got it from Hume or they got this other part from Descartes, but they get it from osmosis. It has a certain logic to it. You can kind of fill in the blanks. You just hear a little bit of it. So in many ways, the sense data theory is alive and well, and it's believed in by a whole bunch of people who maybe don't even know it's called the sense data theory.
Yeah, sure.
They don't know, the state of the art on the debates about it.
I think that's right.
I always hesitate in these kinds of discussions to say well, we've moved on. We all know the sense data theory is a non-starter. Well, I'm not so sure. There's a lot of things that we haven't moved on from.
Sure.
The things we really have moved on from are things that almost no one hears about anymore. Back in medieval times, there used to be these debates about how gaining weight works. Have you ever heard this one? Well, according to Catholic theology, the resurrection of the dead would be bodily.
Right.
And so God is going to resurrect you after the judgment day, and you're going to have your body again. But what body is it going to be? Now, suppose the person being resurrected is someone like me, someone who's gotten amazingly fat in their adult lifetime. Now, is they knew enough about biology to know that eating food somehow is contributing to your expansion. But how is it contributing? Is it adding matter? Is it adding substance to the body? Or is it somehow just making the body bigger without adding to its material? And that matters if because you want to know, like, am I going to be fat in heaven, right? Or so there were all these debates about, like, well, how does digestion work, and how does gaining weight work? Also, what happens when you eat the Eucharist? If you're eating the body of Christ, and digestion means that you're actually adding matter to your body, are you now made out of Christ? Like, so there are these debates that they took very seriously, and no one talks about. To my knowledge, I don't. Maybe I'm missing out. There's someone somewhere in some corner of Twitter talking about how getting fat works given the Catholic theology. I haven't seen that. People are arguing about the existence of God and stuff, but not how to explain gaining weight. So some things do actually pass out of philosophical consciousness, but sense data theory has not cleared the system yet, especially if we allow, as we should, non-professionals to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting how certain aspects of theology have been, or indeed of a pre-scientific outlook generally, have been preserved and are considered okay and respectable, and we can keep debating those. But other aspects, we've just said no. Well, we'll ignore that because that really is too weird. And even though some of the bits that we've kept are pretty weird. What puzzled me about the sense data thing was, though, that we seem to have phenomenal realists, people I call phenomenal realists, they seem to have kept this idea that there is this infallibly known stuff, and it's mental and so on. But it doesn't really do anything because it doesn't do the work of representing the world, because many of them are happy to be representation. I think David Chalmers is, although it's complicated because he has his Edenic content and so on. But they're happy to say that we can represent the world in a way that is, at least at a personal level, direct. We're not aware of intermediaries because there's all sorts of problems about that. But they still say, but at the same time, there are these mental properties that you do know with the kind of assurance that we're supposed to know sense data. So they've basically taken sense data and sort of made them redundant. They said, well, you're still there, you still exist, okay, but you don't have any work to do any longer. That seems to be a really odd position. If you're going to keep these things, give them something to do. And of course, the answer may be, well, that's just the way the world is. It's just, this happens that this stuff's there, and it's the intrinsic nature, and you can't, of course, stuff's going to have an intrinsic nature, and this is what it is, and that's it. And, don't ask what it does. It's just the intrinsic nature stuff. Yeah, but
it's. I'm tempted to speak on behalf of the person you're arguing against, and so with respect to these, what do you want to call them? Qualia?
Yeah. Well, whatever. Yeah. Go on,
qualia. Aren't they doing all sorts of things? Like, for example, I am retracting my hand from the hot stove because it hurts, and that the painfulness of the pain, that's something. It's not nothing. And right, some of these ideas are ideas that we could see, for example, in Berkeley, right? The painfulness of when you get pricked or cut with a knife, that pain wasn't in the knife waiting for you to come along and suck it up into your finger. People were aware way back then of things like phantom limb phenomenon, that you could have hysterical pain, or you could, like in the phantom limb case, your hand has been amputated and who knows where your hand is, and you're feeling this pain as if in your hand. So where is the pain? It's very natural, with not a whole lot of sophisticated argument, to come to the conclusion that the pain is in the mind. So some of these things that we're experiencing aren't out there.
Sure.
But there's this other way of talking about experiencing that we're quite happy with, where the things we're experiencing are out there, right? Yeah. So, Descartes has the discussion of the two suns with S-U-N-S. There's the sun that's, I forgot exactly how he states it. Yeah. He didn't write in English anyway, so too bad, Descartes. But there's the sun that's given to the intellect, and there's the sun that's given to the senses. Yeah. I think that's kind of how he puts it. Yeah. And then he asks this question: which of those two suns is the one that's more real? Yep. And he's a rationalist and makes the case that the real sun is the sun that's given to the intellect. Yep. If you just trusted your untutored senses, the sun is something that's about as big as your finger grip aperture. It follows you along when you go on a carriage ride. It's warm, but you can't touch it. You get a sunburn, but like if you got up to the real sun, you would appreciate that it's way bigger than your head. It's way bigger than your grip aperture. It's enormous. Yeah, you would burn up way before you got even, thousands of miles away from it. And it's through the intellect that we're able to know the real sun. So we've got these, on the face of it, two kinds of objects of experience. On the one hand, there's the painfulness of pains, that it's in here. But then there's this experience, we experience the sun. And the sun is out there. So what's going on there?
Well,
you could be wrong about the sun, and there was the sun given to the senses anyway. So it's very easy then to do the classical argument from illusion, right? Yeah. Where you can have a dream about the sun, even though it's nighttime. And so there's this really important step in that kind of argument that says, well, you're aware of something.
Yeah.
When you're dreaming about the sun or hallucinating there's the sun, or you're having hysterical pain or phantom limb pain, or seeing a red after image, you appreciate there's nothing red on the wall right now, but you're seeing this red after image after having stared at something green. You're aware of something. And so it's tempting to say that in all of those cases, the thing of which you are aware is in the mind.
Yeah. Well, there's obviously something about that that's right, and that we've got to accommodate. I mean, certainly, this talk isn't tracking nothing at all, and it is tracking something to do with what's happening in you. That's clear. There's the stuff out there, and this talk is tracking that, but this talk at the same time is tracking something in here, and we can try and carve it apart, but often we just conflate it. I mean, this was Thomas Reid on perception and sensation. Two things that we often conflate, but are actually different aspects. I think that's absolutely right, and we've got to do that. It's just that the way that the internal bit is conceptualized as some mental quality that is immediately presented to us.
So let the record show, because I think some people have heard you're an illusionist, and you're like a nihilist. You don't believe in anything. I've heard so many rumors about you, but let the record show you just affirmed that there are sensations.
Of course, there are sensations.
So you're granting there's
it's the nature of these sensations that's the issue. It's of course there are pains and pleasures and all this stuff. Of course there are.
I want everyone to hear.
They're in us. The question is,
there are pains. You grant that there's pains, and would you grant that there's the painfulness of pain?
Well, okay. So we're starting with rarefied. Well, there's whatever that is happening in me when I'm in pain. If you want to call that, I'm instantiating painfulness. I mean, you can call it that. Yeah.
Okay, so pains are painful.
Yeah, of course they are. Well, pains are painful. Well, now hang on. We're starting to we enter states of pain. Okay, no doubt about that. But I mean, we're starting to when you start adding the word ness to adjectives, then it's often creating a bit of unnecessary apparatus. being in pain it's a state of me. Okay, it's a state that I pretty reliably know when I'm in pain. Not always, but if I tell you sincerely that I'm in pain, I'm in pain. I mean, what better evidence do you want? But the illusionist is to the nature of this thing. It's some mental property that sort of floats free of all the pain-related stuff that my nervous system is doing, and all the effects of that on the wider organism. And this is, I think, where my point about this stuff looking redundant is, because yeah, we want to say the pain is something that has effects on me. I mean, if it didn't, what would it wouldn't be bad, would it? But if the pain is something that kind of escapes the observation of the neuroscientist, that somehow doesn't belong to this public world, then it is hard to find a role for it, because it looks like, and any sophisticated phenomenal realist would accept this, that science is going to be able to give a complete causal account of everything that happens, from either me touching the hot stove to me saying ouch and displaying all the pain behavior. They're going to give a complete story about how all that happens, everything that happens in between, in terms that don't mention this irreducibly subjective quality that's supposed to be the essence of pain. So it looks like all the causal work is going to be done by stuff in my nervous system. So then it does look again redundant. And the very people who claim to take consciousness seriously, at the same time, try to conceptualize it as something that doesn't get a causal look in the story. So again, we these things that were supposed to be doing really important work in mediating our relation to the world are now just made redundant. They're just floating around there, or hiding in the intrinsic, the innards of reality, as it were.
I wonder how many people listening or watching right now might be puzzled by this claim that at least some people hold, that it's not doing anything. Right? You and I were old veterans of all these battles, and so we're familiar with this idea that at least for some people, some parties to these discussions, this painfulness of pain, the red, what it's like to see red, that property is not causally efficacious. That property, or those sorts of properties, are epiphenomenal. They don't do anything. And I'm betting a lot of people are puzzled by that. They might not. They might think that, what are you guys talking about? Of course there's people, and they have pains, and they see red, and the painfulness of the pain makes them say ouch, and what it's like to see red makes them say things like, hey, it's like seeing blood and not like seeing green grass. And so maybe we should spend a little time talking about where the epiphenomenal part enters the conversation.
Well, there's let's see if I can articulate this. So look, we have this story, like third-person story, the story that science tells about what's happening when you're in pain, okay, and about the stimulation of nociceptors, pain receptors in your skin or whatever, and the different pathways by which signals are sent to the brain, and all the stuff they do there, and it's an immensely complex story, and eventually it eventuates in terminates in pain behavior of all kinds, and all sorts of psychological effects of pain, memories and desires, beliefs, and so on. So it has all these effects. So there's that story, but that story doesn't seem to include this essentially private quality of the pain, because the neuroscientist just doesn't detect that or see that anywhere in the stuff they're investigating. And the idea is, you could know all about that physical stuff without knowing about the nature of the pain itself if you never felt it, like Mary and the color red. Okay, so there's different things you can do at that point. You can say, well, nevertheless, there is this quality there, and it doesn't figure in the causal story, so it plays no causal role. It's like the steam coming from the steam engine. It's just there and it's present, and it accompanies the states that are doing the causal work, which is why we think wrongly that it is in fact doing the work itself, because it's always present when the physical states that actually do the causal work are present. So we just assume that it's doing the causal work. That's one thing you see, being epiphenomenalist. Another thing is you can say, well, somehow the physical story is kind of missing something out. Somehow the physical story is incomplete. We've got to. Neuroscience isn't complete. There's stuff happening there that can't be just explained in neuroscientific terms. Okay, so we should then find gaps in that story. Which is, well, look, this is happening. These neurons are firing with no explanation, no physical explanation. They're firing because of this this quality that can't be physically identified. The third thing you can do is to say, we're thinking of pain in the wrong way. Pain isn't something extra in addition to all of those processes. Pain just kind of is those processes, and that's the position that I take. That's the position you take. I think that pretty much carves it up, doesn't it? Really. Epiphenomenalism, somehow it's some sort of interactionism or something like illusion.
I suppose so. I have to confess, I got kind of hung up on your early setup. This is not your fault. This is entirely mine. But you said the word seem, and I got internally excited.
Okay.
And my recollection is you said something like, "Well, the scientists have this explanation of what's going on, and when someone is seeing red or is in pain, it's this causal physical story that could be told in terms of neurons firing, and it doesn't seem like there's." And that's when I was like, wait a minute.
Okay.
Maybe that's where the trouble arises. You might say, so it doesn't seem like pain is in that story, or it doesn't seem like red is in that story. But so what?
Right.
Why credit the way things seem?
Right.
With respect to this question about whether they're there or not. So, and you might say, well, maybe it's something like this. Scientists can give, if we look at scientific explanation, like literal scientific explanations of stuff. For example, physics, if we go read physics papers and look at what physicists are explaining, I bet none of them mention hats.
Yeah, sure.
I bet none of those papers talk about chairs. Now, would we conclude that there's no room for chairs or hats in the world that science has something to say about? One possibility is that, they didn't mention them by name.
Yeah.
They're talking about collections of particles and what would happen if such and such mass was in such and such field, and they didn't mention chairs by name.
Yeah.
They don't have a theory that's explicitly about hats and tells you when you have a hat versus just half a hat versus just an elaborate scarf. But nonetheless, their theory covers it, because don't we all know that whatever a hat is, it's a bunch of atoms. Whatever a chair is, there's difficult questions about, what counts as furniture and what doesn't count as furniture, and is a tree stump a chair? But whatever the right answer is to what a chair is, it's not going to be that chairs have like chair souls, or a non-physical telos is inside of it. I hope not. It's just atoms. Whatever chairs are, it's some pile of atoms or other.
Right.
And so the physicists actually do have a story that includes chairs, not by name. It's got hats in it.
But if you're going to do that with pains though, you've got to be thinking of pains in a way that makes them amenable to that sort of treatment. Okay, so that they're just complex patterns or organizations of this stuff. Okay, but that I think you need to move to the third position. You need to do a bit of reconceptualization on your, because if you conceptualized pain and these other things in such a way that you can clearly, or at least you've convinced yourself that you can clearly imagine all that physical stuff. I'm using physical here, sort of fairly loose. You can imagine all of that being present and organized into all the complex ways that it is, with all the, the higher level patterns that manifest themselves when it's put together, and all the higher level causal patterns that you see. And you can imagine all of that without this thing. And people believe that they can, because that's what a P-zombie is supposed to be. If you're thinking of it in that way, then that route is, you've closed off that route to yourself, because you're conceptualizing consciousness in a way that doesn't yield to the same sort of incorporation into the natural world that we have for other things like chess. So you have to do this bit of reconceptualize. That's where the illusion bit comes in.
Well, so just to go slow, in part because I as Pete Mandic, Playboy, and Persuader, I'm very interested in what Keith Qua, other Persuader. I'm very interested in what you think about illusionism.
Lord Brett Sinclair.
Lord
and he has a better car as well.
By the way, it's always bothered me that Bertrand Russell was a lord. Like, I don't know if you have
Earl.
It was Earl. Is that worse?
No.
That's worse, right?
I don't know.
Anyway, by the way, slide aside, one of my professors in undergrad was Peter Winch. I don't know if you've ever heard of Peter. He wrote the social sciences, the very idea. He was this Wittgensteinian. Anyways, very, very British, and it's I had some conversation with him, and I said, because I was a jerk, more so than I am now in my 20s. I said, with you Brits, it's so weird that you have a queen.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, he was ready. He's like, yeah, well, you Americans and your flag, it's pretty creepy. Some of the things you say to that flag. And I point
should be rethinking all that 1777 stuff. Right? You see, if you'd stuck with us, you'd have been like Canada now. You'd have been or Australia. It would all been nice. No problems, free healthcare.
A lot of us are rethinking that whole independence thing. Could have been a big mistake. So anyway, it sounds to me like what you were saying is that at least one of the arguments you could give to kind of motivate epiphenomenalism was the zombie argument, or more broadly, like these modal arguments. That if it's possible that you could have all that stuff, neurons firing without any pain, and how would you know it's possible? Well, you try to imagine it, or you try to conceive of it and see if you run into any contradictions. Well, if it's possible for them to come apart, then they can't be the same thing. They would have to be two different things. And if you already know what is doing the causing, and it's the physical stuff, then if there is this other thing, seems like it's epiphenomenal. It seems like it's actually not doing anything. But that's, I think, understandably hard for a lot of people to get their heads around, because how are we even talking about it if it's not doing anything?
Frank Jackson had that lovely line in Epiphenomenal Qualia, in which he defended epiphenomenalism. It's the paper in which he introduced the Mary argument.
Right.
In which he said the main problem for most people in admitting the existence of qualia is that they would have to be given a causal role with respect to the physical world, and it's hard to maintain this without sounding like someone who believes in fairies. And I love that line. And so he says, well, I don't believe in fairies. They don't do anything. They just accompany the things that do things. And so effectively, as I say, you're making them redundant. You're saying you can still hang around. We don't want you to go away, but there's nothing for you to do anymore.
And in the Mary case, the argument is like not so much about what you can conceive, but what you would know
Mm.
or versus not know, which might be slightly different. You could know all that physical stuff without knowing what it's like to experience pain or what it's like to.
And I think there's a very simple, there's a very simple basis to all of this. And I think the intuition that these people have is, given the way they're conceptualizing consciousness and conceptualizing pain and so on, it's perfectly right, because they're conceiving it as something, as I might say, irreducibly subjective, as belonging essentially to another world, not to the public world that we all, that we can all investigate collectively. It belongs to private worlds that are known only to selves, whatever the hell they are. And now, if you conceive of it in that way, well, sure, you're going to be able to imagine one way or the other, because when you imagine, the stuff that Mary knows, or you imagine your P-zombie, you're imagining it as part of the public world. You imagine it in third-person terms. So, of course, you're going to be able to imagine that it lacks this other world, because you've just, that's the way you built in a dualism right at the start of it.
Yeah.
Of course, you're going to be able to imagine one without the other, and then from that you can just go on building and building and building your theories. But just stop doing that. just stop doing that, and everything changes.
So one thing I wonder about this stuff, and I'm going to apologize to everybody for. I'm going to ascend to the level of some jargony shop talk. I hope I don't leave too many of our listeners behind. But there's one way of hearing what you're saying, Keith, that they have to, in order for them to make this inference, they have to have this conception of consciousness as irreducibly subjective. If they had that conception, then they could make these inferences. Yeah. There's a way of hearing that whereby the way inference works is you've got this representation that is something like spelling out your definition, your analysis of what you're talking about. So you've got something like, it's an analytic truth that if there's phenomenal consciousness, then there's something that is intrinsically subjective, right? Irreducibly subjective. Since it's irreducibly subjective, it cannot be reduced to any of the stuff that Mary gets in her physicalistic textbook. And so it just follow deductively that consciousness isn't physical, but also trivially. Now, okay, that my impression is that the people you and ultimately I am arguing against, they believe in the synthetic a priori. Right. What you've just described is a very old-fashioned view of how a priori knowledge is obtained, and it's strictly in terms of like these deductive inferences from analytic truths. But Kant and Kripke made it okay to, like, I don't know what, just you grasp the synthetic a priori. You know stuff, even though it's not by way of some definition and then a deduction from that definition. And high-level operators like Chalmers probably know how to defend that, or at least give a defense that you might have to contend with. But I bet a lot of his clients and consumers have just kind of picked up on pieces of that and think that it's just it's enough to just imagine stuff.
Yeah.
Can you imagine a zombie? Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, mission accomplished. Good job. Right. Yeah. They don't know that there's this history and about how all this stuff works behind the scenes. And by this stuff, I don't mean consciousness. I mean philosophy. Like how do you draw philosophical conclusions? And there was a long stretch in Western philosophy where it was either deduce or shut up. If you didn't have an analytic definition, you're not going to derive any kind of knowledge from that. And then, I'm probably screwing up the history, but a very simplified version of it is that Quine, even though we like to count him as among the good guys, Quine pooped on analyticity quite a bit. and Kripke came along and showed how you could get necessity without analyticity by way of maybe Putnam something 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 right, filling the gaps.
He showed how to bury the bodies so that, you know, he said how to pack it away into some. I mean, I grant everything you said. I think you're right, and it's a complex story.
But let me just try to like extract myself from the jargon and give people who might be a little bit lost something to hold on to. In this environment where, you know, you've got people saying, "Hey, it's okay to talk about the synthetic a priori." One of the things that it seems like it's licensed is you could do stuff like say, "Well, look, when I introspect my conscious states, this is how it seems to me." And some of this has a tradition you could trace back to Descartes. Like when Descartes describes the cogito, he explicitly saying things like, "No, it's not an inference." By the way, it was an inference. He was just lying to us. But he says, like, no, it's just when I consider it, when it's before my mind, I see its truth.
But he recognized that it wasn't just enough that was a psychological compulsion that he felt. He had to have that underwritten by something. And so he needed God to, you know, to guarantee that when he felt this kind of compulsion and he was doing his best, damn it, you know, then God wouldn't let him go wrong because he'd been really good at being, you know. So you still, you know, you don't get from a psychological thing to an insight into necessity. And that's precisely where I think the notion of illusion comes in. Because I think people do find this. I mean, and I do think it's often by an appeal to imagination, to the what's the word, to the positive conceivability. It's the idea that you have this sense that there's a world in here that's somehow distinct from the world out there. That isn't just a complex part of it, but is actually a different world. And there's something about the nature of introspection that, at least if it doesn't immediately equip us with that sense, it makes it very easy to pump up that intuition that nobody could possibly know what this world in here is really like. They can infer it from hints and so on, and they can analogy and so on, but they can never really get in here. And I think that's wrong, and I think you've got to accept that that's wrong. And I think that's a kind of introspective illusion, and that's the root of this. And this is why people find it so easy to do this without spelling it out in the way that I did about irreducible subjectivity and so on. But that kind of packs in those, implicitly packs in those premises into the way we conceptualize it. So that's kind of what is, in a way, Descartes could have said, look, you know, this could be an illusion, but that God guarantees it ain't. The trouble is, we don't have God here to guarantee that it ain't. But at least he was clear enough that it could have been, if God wasn't there to guarantee it.
You know, there's I think that this point of the general dialectic is super interesting. Just personally, really interested in this part of in the conversations about illusionism, because so many people struggle so hard with this question: how could that be an illusion?
Yes, right? They do.
They get how, like, in general, like roughly how a mirage would work, right? How it looks like there's a puddle of water out there, but there's no puddle of water. But okay, how could you be wrong about whether it at least seems like a puddle of water, right? I feel like I get it, but when you really think it through, and you can kind of see why people might not get it. One way to put it is, and I don't know how much of this you're going to like, Keith, but this works for me. If you draw a distinction between belief and so-called sensations, like there's a difference between having a sensation of red or a sensation of pain and believing or thinking. There's this point I first heard from Tim Crane. He marshaled this against David Papineau in the discussions over phenomenal concepts. Tim Crane says, look, couldn't you think or believe and be right, I am not now currently in pain, or I am not now having a blue experience? And I think the right answer to those questions is, yeah, you could think that, or you could believe that. You could believe that you're not currently having a red experience, and it's true, you're not currently having a red experience. And then what that shows is that whatever a so-called red experience is, it's not a belief, or it's not thinking. Those are two different things. And here is an answer to the question, how could that be an illusion, when asked of an illusionist? And the answer is like, well, you could think you have a red sensation and be wrong, because they're two different things. And that is, for many people, even myself, that's kind of a head trip. Like to think like that you could believe you're having a red sensation and you're not having a red sensation.
If you, well,
I think it's brilliant and important thought. And in a lot of ways, like, this is what Dennett's consciousness explained is all about. And he spells it out. Like, I think in the preface to the book, right, when he's talking about the combinatorial explosion, and he's talking about, like, here's a way to make a convincing virtual reality, is you control the person to just have a few beliefs and not try to investigate further. So if you manipulate their epistemic curiosity and get them to just believe things like, oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of Marilyn Monroes on the wallpaper. You don't have to have a picture of a whole bunch of Marilyn Monroes, which would be computationally, like, once you get your head around that,
and pointless unless it created the beliefs.
Once you get your head around that possibility, then yes, illusionism that makes an amazing amount of sense, especially since there's nothing plausibly red or green inside my brain. There's nothing to be the sensation. So how is it that it can seem to us that something's painful? Well, we believe that it's painful. It doesn't have to actually be painful for you to believe that it's painful. But so many people, and I'm not saying this is a put down to them, because I think this is a very hard and weird idea, but so many people struggle with, like, wait a minute, I could believe I have mental images and I wouldn't have mental images, but it would seem to be like I did simply, right? You really have to, like, go over it over and over again before it starts to sink in that, like, yeah, right, you could think you have a blue sensation even though you don't, and it would seem to you like you did. And that's how illusionism is not self-undermining.
I mean, I'm very much on board with what you're saying. I think one qualification is you need to understand belief here in quite a liberal sense. So we're not talking about the sort of reflective beliefs that we hold and that we can adopt and discard and so on. We're talking about various kinds of belief-like representation, takings of the world to be certain ways, which may themselves come in many different varieties. One thing I would say is that has to be a possibility. I think the idea that you could believe that there is you're having a certain sensation while you're not, if you think the sensations are just states of the world, that are ontologically on a par with all the other furniture of the world around us. Because, if they are and they're distinct from the beliefs, then of course the belief could be wrong about it. I mean, there may be an extremely reliable mechanism by one tracks the other, but none of mechanisms are magical. They can always go wrong, just as I could be wrong about the stuff that's outside this. So I could be wrong about the stuff that's inside it if it's just part of the normal furniture of the world. So it's just taking seriously the idea that we are evolved organisms that are not, we're taking seriously the rejection of dualism. The other thing I would say, that I think there is something more that can be said as well. I mean, I think that's the key thing to say, and that's of course how what illusionists will say in response to the question. Well, but if it seems to you that you're having that's when the illusionist wants to say it seems that we're having qualia, people will say, well, but seemings themselves involve qualia. No, they don't need to. They can be just cognitive states, just states of belief. But the other thing I want to say is I think there's an aspect of this infallibility that illusionists can capture if they take seriously the idea that when we talk about the feel of experience, we're in part talking about our reactions, about how we're reacting to stimulation, and because one of the characteristic reactions to, say, seeing something red is saying I can see something red. or it looks red to me, or one of the characteristic reactions to being having bodily injury of some sort is saying I'm in pain. So the report is actually one of the reactions that is partially constitutive of the experience itself. So to that extent, in saying that I'm in pain, I'm giving, the very report that I'm in pain is itself partially constitutive of being in pain. So you can get something like you can get that sort of authority, a constitutive kind of authority.
But
in addition,
that makes it sound like someone who has their mouth taped shut would automatically have a different experience because they couldn't give the report. It's hard to parse exactly what the claim is there to rule out.
No, let's say the belief then, and then we can just track it back to saying that the point is that having the belief that you're in pain is partially constitutive of being in pain. So it's that you see, of course, that's now partially closing the gap.
Yeah,
I agree that there is a gap. Because that's not all that believing you're in pain is not all there is to being in pain. There's a lot of other stuff too, which you could be wrong about. Believing you're in pain is partially constitutive.
About 20 years ago, I spent a lot of time trying to defend that kind of view, and I took a lot of heat from my friends who are, I think, we're all proponents of higher order thought theory, especially the David Rosenthal version. And one of the things that's central to the David Rosenthal version is that when it comes to consciousness, there's nothing about which you could be that you would be guaranteed to be right about. It's always possible that you could be wrong about how things seem to you. And this is something that Dennett and Rosenthal, even though Dennett was a materialist, he liked this infallibility thing. Although recently took it back, like one of the last papers Dennett published, he took it back a little bit. And I would, a lot of this stuff centers on a debate between, on the one hand, Rosenthal and his minions, and on the other hand, people like Alex Byrne and Ned Block, who would give Rosenthal a hard time about this so-called empty higher order thought problem.
Yes.
Like suppose you think you're having an experience of green, the first order mental state, which is about the world containing something green. Suppose you think you have such first order visual experience, and you don't. On one way of reading the theory, it would seem to you like you have a phenomenally conscious state, and you don't have any phenomenally conscious state. But that would seem to pull apart what it's like to be you and whether you're in a conscious state. Now, lots of people have tried to solve that problem by maybe gluing together the first order state and the high order state. Uriah Kriegel and Rocco Gennaro, they have this like same order theory where it refers to itself. And I flirted with that myself. I thought like, well, maybe we could construct some kind of examples whereby there were mental states that were kind of like these cogito states in being about themselves. They guarantee that there's a truth maker. The truth bearer and the truth maker are just one and the same. And Josh Weisberg and Richard Brown and a couple other people that were at the CUNY Grad Center at the time gave me so much grief about it. And the thing that would convince me is how few, plausible examples you could come up with. It would be really rare, strange things. Like, for example, this thought is about itself. Okay, but but I'm having an experience of a chicken. On the face of it, that it's just a higher order representation of a first order representation. There's nothing self-referent, right? It just seems really ad hoc.
Yeah, I certainly want to push it that far. I think the higher order people tie themselves in knots because they have a realist conception.
And that made me, one of the things that it made me do is to suspect the motive in the first place. Like, where did we get this motive for thinking that we have to be infallible? And I became convinced that we're just moved by this really dumb offense intended, this really dumb picture of how knowledge works. That like,
Yeah.
which I made a blog post where I called it this folksy ocular epistemology.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then several weeks later realized that I was just plagiarizing Rorty. I went and reread the Philosophy of the Mirror Nature and realized, like, oh, well, that's just what Rorty was saying. His whole thing about man's glassy essence, and which he himself has lived getting from like Dewey and Peirce. So we're all these Americans, Keith, have seen this, that we being human beings have internalized this way that vision works, which is that you can see things better when you're closer to them. And so we think that if something is all the way in here, like all the way in the mind, then boom, you couldn't be wrong about that.
Almost like it's an illusion, Pete.
So yeah, if you remove that, why should we believe in infallibility?
I think you're right. I mean, essentially, I agree. I mean, if you think that introspection is a natural process that it depends on evolved mechanisms, then you should expect it to be just as prone to to being selective, distorting, and creating illusions as perception is. I mean, it's evolved for certain purposes, and it's as good as it needs to be for those purposes, and no better. And I mean, that's just introspective illusions. We should expect them to be as common as perceptual ones, unless you think that introspection is kind of magic, and you think that it's the introspector is something other than a biological brain, which is dependent on evolved mechanisms for its knowledge.
I wonder how much we can pin on an idea that we might put that consciousness just is whatever is given to consciousness. So the way things seem, that's all there is when it comes to consciousness. For other things, there's at least two parts to it. So like there's the way my headphones seem, and that's just going to be at best like the surface stuff. But there's so much more to my headphones than you and I have access to without fancy tools. There's all sorts of microscopic stuff going on. So we might say that for most things that there is this hidden depth to them, or we might say they have a backside. There's the front side. The front side is superficial, thin. There's so much more to objective things than the way they subjectively seem to us. But when we're talking about consciousness itself, it just is the subjective seeming, which you, Keith Frankish, might want to say like, well, you're defining it as irreducibly subjective then, aren't you? And there's a sense in which, yeah, that's what we're trying to talk about. We're trying to talk about the way things seem to you. And that's me trying to argue on behalf of anti-illusionists. I don't really believe what I'm saying right now.
With a lot of these things, with a lot of these doctrines that we inveigh against, like libertarian free will and phenomenal realism, and so you can have a version of that, but you've got to do a little bit of rethinking. And the way you can have a version of that is to treat consciousness as a sort of fiction, that you're to treat this private subjective world. You can say, yeah, it's private, but it's a fiction. It's a story you've kind of concocted on the basis of all the discriminations that your brain is making, the discriminations with regard to its own activity that it's making, and you come up with this story. And yeah, all there is to a story is what you put into it. I mean, whether Sherlock Holmes is, has a mustache or not is just dependent on whether or not Conan Doyle says he has. There's nothing else to it. Conan Doyle couldn't be wrong about that because that's all there is to his having it. And so that's where you can get this kind of infallibility, by just making it a story. This is a very Dennettian line.
But I just want to point out how, by the way, can I swear? Are cuss words?
Well, you can try and see what happens.
Let's see what happens. So the earlier thing I was talking about as what I would call like a real head fucker, which is that you could believe that you have a red sensation without actually having a red sensation, and it would seem the same. But now you're floating something even more head fucky, which is that there's not even the belief that there is a believer who believes that. That's just a fictional story.
There's all sorts of real stuff that's happening, and there's also real discriminations that are being made by my brain, and made for good reasons. This story about the irreducibly subjective world, populated by this stuff that doesn't figure in the public world, that is the bit that's a fiction. It's a fiction constructed on the basis of all sorts of real discriminations, or perhaps misdiscriminations, misrepresentations that are being made by systems in my brain. So it's doing all sorts of stuff, but I'm just concocting for public consumption, or for my own consumption, perhaps, maybe principally for my own consumption, this story about my wonderful, essentially private inner life.
So I just want to drill down on this because I am delighted by it. Although this will probably repel lots of people from ever wanting to be an illusionist. But there's a way of hearing all this whereby, okay, there aren't any qualia or sensations. There's hold on. Let me try the full dirty version of it, and then maybe see what part you don't like. So there aren't really sensations / qualia. There's just beliefs about them, but there aren't any beliefs either, because that's just like a story being told by brains about brains. This is sort of like if we were to say about Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Okay, look, there's no white whale. There's just this story about the white whale. And the story itself is a construct, right? Because which words printed on which day, I'm sure there's lots of different drafts of Moby Dick and lots of different versions. And Melville's dead now. So what counts as the portions of the universe, the collections of atoms, which are identical to the story of Moby Dick, that itself is a construct that depends on who says what when, which librarians and publishers, etc., have said this and that about the novel. But the reality of the novel is kind of itself nebulous. It's not as real as the clouds of atoms that are candidates for what it is. And so these layers of unreality are ultimately all there is to being in excruciating pain or seeing bright, vivid red. It's as unreal as the value of a pound note. It's just a construct.
No.
Held aloft by these jibber-jabbering sacks of meat that have nervous systems that evolved.
Okay, it's rooted in stuff that's very real and potent and so on. I mean, pound notes. You with pound notes of euros or dollars, whatever, you can get people. You can get all sorts of potent effects with those things. Okay, not in virtue of some intrinsic magical power that they have, but because people want them, and they will do all sorts of stuff for them, and so there's all sorts of real hard-nosed stuff happening. And then it gets represented at different levels, and at one level of generality gets into this story about these kind of magical inner worlds. A lot of fiction is, is firmly rooted in real experience. I mean, Moby Dick, it kind of tells us about all sorts of things about human life. I can't do an analysis of it now, but the point is, the reason people read it is not because it's just kind of unanchored fantasy that's just bears no relation to the real world. It's because it tells you important things about human existence and the meaning of human life and the striving for impossible goals and this sort of thing. And so, it doesn't make it. Calling it a story doesn't make it less real. It's arguable that I think that our fiction, that our creative fiction, and our poetry and our drama and our art and so on, that's some of the most potent things we have, because they condense vast tracts of experience into vivid little packages that explode when we read them in our minds. So, calling it a story isn't to denigrate. In fact, what you have, I guess, in non-human animals is you have all the vivid meatiness of pain and all the potency of the reactions, but you don't have this story about its wider significance for you, about what it means for you, about the fears, the anxieties, the sense of how it's distorting your view of the world and your ability to pursue your activities and so on. I'm kind of go quite the opposite way and say this makes it more real.
So I'm one opponent for you that I'm very interested in right now is not the Philip Goff or the David Chalmers, but it's someone like Richard Brown, who I hope Richard won't mind me portraying his view like this. Look, brains, atoms, that's really real. So is phenomenal consciousness. That's really real too. And here's a very simple way of seeing how it all hangs together. It's the same thing. The conscious experiences, which is really, really real, it's identical in this old-timey 1950s type identity theory way. So what the hell are you illusionists talking about? When you tell me it's not real, but it is real, like, what is it? Remind me what you say about money. Is money real? Is money as real as gallbladders? or some, Dennis got this real patterns thing, right? Where he has like layers of semi-reality, and there's all sorts of stuff that's real, but some of it is more really real than others.
Money is real. It's part of our ontology, and it's a very important part of it. We organize a lot of our activity around it. What's not, but what doesn't, is it only earns a place in that ontology because of the utility of talking about it and so on, and conceptualizing things in terms of it. What doesn't earn a place in our ontology is the idea of the intrinsic value of monetary tokens. The idea that they get their potency from some power that's intrinsic to the tokens. No, they get it from their embedding in a wider system, social system, economic system, the psychology of individual agents. That's what gives them their potency. The sense that money has an intrinsic value is not completely wrong, because it's a sort of simplistic conceptualization of all that wider potency from its embedding. So yes, money does have a power, but it doesn't have it in virtue of some properties of the tokens. It has it in virtue of the dispositions of the wider system, and that's exactly what I would say about experience. That the particular patterns of brain activity that are involved, they get their significance from their embedding in a much wider pattern of neural activity, of psychological neural activity described at the psychological level, from embedding in social contexts and in contexts of self-storytelling, self-narrative.
So you're a functionalist about monetary value, and the functional base might be this big thing that includes multiple people and spread across multiple continents. And but the painfulness of pain. Mm-hmm. Some say that's a quail. But you you once made fun of diet qualia. That used to be what you were famous for before you got really famous being an illusionist. Are you being a functionalist about qualia, or is there still something sneaky about qualia that they're not allowed? They're too.
The point that I'm a functionalist about money. I'm a functionalist about experience. Okay, I'm an eliminativist about the intrinsic vim, as Dan called it, of money, the intrinsic, the potency that makes money, that gives money its functional role. The idea that money has this functional in virtue of possessing some intrinsic causal powers. Okay, that it's that belong to the thing, to the tokens itself, and that are not to the wider embedding. And exactly the same with experience. I'm an eliminativist about the idea of the intrinsic nature of the physical state involved with a pattern of brain activity or whatever. But I'm a functionalist about experience. I think those two things are perfectly. I've never been an eliminativist about experience in the everyday sense. About I don't think anyone is about. Nobody denies the existence of pains, of sensations in the everyday sense.
Wait a minute. There's this guy who published a paper about the myth of sensations. You should check him out. Pete Mandic.
Oh, I see what you're doing.
Yeah, so
this is tricky. This is you're using sensation there. Oh, come on. This is the point where you see, if we were the real persuaders, we would start having a fight now, and we would start throwing
bang, pow.
Yeah. You rotter, you. Yes, I have read that paper. I do know it. Yeah, but you're using sensation in a somewhat more technical sense. You're using it in a more philosophical. Yeah,
it's interesting. A lot of these terms,
you're using it like sense data, aren't you? Pretty much.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Well then. Pretty
much.
There you go.
A lot of these terms that we treat as something that common sense folk psychology has something to say about, and then conceptual analytical philosophers can analyze the armchair. A lot of these things start off not long ago as technical terms introduced by philosophers. So
yes, this is true.
Like the word consciousness enters the English language courtesy of Ralph Wedgwood, who was reading Descartes, and then Locke picks up on it. So the earliest instances of consciousness, which is basically borrowing from Latin, is what Locke says it is. Like the etymology of it is like this with knowing.
I think it's I think I may be wrong. I may be wrong, but isn't it knowing with? And that it's like, so it could be a conspiracy that you know something with someone else.
I think that by the time it's coming in through like Wedgwood and Locke, it's like what Locke says. It's the perception of what passes through a man's mind.
So it's knowing with yourself. Then it's sort of knowing.
It's so Leibniz coins this phrase apperception, right?
Yes.
Which is, so he is in part reading Descartes, who seems to be trying to talk about the mind is just always this self reflecting thing. He creates this two-level kind of picture. But apperception, consciousness are entering in, a few hundred years ago in European philosophy, as specifically these technical terms denoting a kind of metacognition or knowledge one has of one's own knowledge.
Right.
And but my point is just simply to say, similar thing is true of sensations. Sensations kind of enters in as a technical term. It's a psychological theory about how perception works, whereby, you've got like this raw feels sense data theory. And some of this comes from Kant, right? Kant's got this two-tier system of how perception works, whereby there's like the intuition, and then the concept. And you need those both to have an empirical judgment. And he's trying to make this fit with this Aristotelian picture of like form and matter, where the intuitions are like the matter and the concept is providing the form. And so much of that, what we think is like peeling back what we all think, what what is just built into our language or our common sense. It's made up technical stuff that we long ago forgot. That's how it started.
I agree, though. I think it's not sort of made up out of whole cloth, though. I mean, there's a psychological, the ground. Psychologists prepared the ground for these notions to take root. I think. I could imagine. I think I can imagine creatures who don't find it as natural to conceptualize their own mental activity in these ways. Perhaps ones whose introspective abilities were either much more limited than ours, or ones whose introspective abilities are much more extensive than ours, more like sort of Paul Churchland's introspectors, who can really see the detail of what's happening. So I think we're positioned at a sort of mid thing, which is what you'd expect, I guess, from an evolutionary perspective. We just have enough knowledge about what's happening inside our heads, that we need for purposes of, I guess, higher level control. We don't. So think about Michael Graziano's attention schema, the idea that we need some information about our own attentional processes to be able to control them. But we don't need to know all the messy detail, and that gives us a simplest, a caricature of what attention is that helps to foster a kind of dualism. So I'm inclined to look for psychological sources for these philosophical theories. Because the thing is, it's not hard to get people to accept a lot of these intuitions, intuitions about consciousness, about free will, and so on. But I agree that I think we need to be much more aware of the historical roots of our thinking on these things. It's very easy to think that just because you're doing it from the armchair, you're not doing it without a lot of people kind of looking over your shoulder and nudging you.
So I want to sneak in one more thing, because I'm also sensitive to the passage of time.
Yes, we need to.
So I was recently reading some Peter Godfrey Smith.
Good person to read.
And he is what I suppose we should call one of these bioluminescence people.
Well,
at least the thing of his I was reading was really trying to push that consciousness and subjectivity in the Hegelian sense of like having a point of view enters the scene around the same time that you have animals entering the scene.
Yes,
that once you have life that's complicated enough to be moving around and needing a nervous system to coordinate the different different cellular areas in order to get something like, moving and detecting obstacles and moving towards some things and away from other things. That's when you start getting a point of view and subjectivity. And I'm just bringing this up to ask you, are you inclined to think that consciousness is something that could exist in such simple systems? Or are you more inclined to think it's more like Graziano, once you got something like an attentional schema or an ability to think of yourself as having consciousness or apperception or something like that? Like where or do you even care? Some people might say,
I think these are quite different questions. They're quite different questions. Whether you're inclined to conceptualize, whether a creature's inclined to conceptualize its own mental activity as a private mental level.
No, but I'm trying to ask a question about this thing that you disagree strongly with Chalmers and Goff about.
Well, that doesn't exist.
Whatever's left over and is consistent with your kind of functional physicalist view of the world. Where in this phylogenetic scale are you located?
Bad question, because it's multidimensional.
That's a good answer.
It's multidimensional. It's graded on each dimension. it's like life. It comes in many different forms. It has many different aspects. It's, a virus is alive. Who knows? Doesn't matter. It's just a terminological question. It's like asking, when did memory come in? When did memory? You need to specify it a bit and say exactly what you mean by when did learning come? When did reading? They're all sloppy folk notions. Get more precise about. Tell me about what particular kinds of awareness you're interested in, and then we can see if these creatures are capable of it. And if they are, whether you call it consciousness, who cares? Now. That's just a bad question. Looking for marks of consciousness is like looking for, marks of, I was going to say life, but I think that's probably it's even more nebulous than life. But even there, you get like half a dozen different ones that can come in different grades, and they're not all necessary. You can have living things that can't reproduce and so on.
Yeah.
It's just a very unhelpful and pointless question. Ask about something specific, some specific form of awareness, some specific discriminative capacity, and see if it has it.
So I think I agree with that 100%. And probably the way I would like to put it is, one way to put it is that it's not really a deep natural kind, like the way, saying that something is oxygen. Right. There's a lot that comes along with being oxygen, but saying something implements a memory, that's a very thin, superficial, functional kind.
Absolutely.
And similar with face, whether an animal has a face or not, and where that's
a nice one. I like that.
Yeah. There are faces, but no, there's no fact of the matter about where an octopus's face is, or even if it has one. Who cares?
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
And some people just cannot accept that. I know, for example, like I had a friendly argument in person with Eric Schwitzcable about exactly this, that, I was saying like whether something has consciousness or not is just like whether something has a face or not.
Yeah, I agree totally.
Or as I would now put it, it's like asking how would a dog wear pants? There's in some sense, no answer there.
And people, this worries people because they think they need some sort of kind of categorical marker of ethical value. And the trouble is, they want this thing and they want it to either be present or not, but they put it sort of beyond our epistemic reach because we can't tell whether it's there or not. It is there, and we've just got to speculate about this by doing armchair metaphysics. Ridiculous way to proceed. Now you just ask whether we should care about an octopus. Well, study octopodes, octopuses. Octopuses, I'm going to say octopi is terribly wrong. Octopodes would be better, more accurate to the Greek, but we'll say octopuses. Study them. Study what things they can discriminate. Study what effect, and study how they react to the things they can discriminate. What sort of effects does, say, I don't know, really hot water have on an octopus? Study it. Study how similar its reactions, its sensitivities and its reactive dispositions are to ours. Map this in as much detail as you want, then ask yourself, how much do you care about that? There's no sort of hidden code in which the ethical value is written. You've got to decide how much you care about that. That all the facts that are relevant to making the decision are there. And the facts are relevant because if it doesn't react to anything, if it's just like a stone and doesn't react at all, then there's not much point in caring about it. Unless you value it for some aesthetic reasons or something.
Well, Keith, you just gave me an idea for a science fiction story.
Ooh,
and it goes like this. In the distant future, it's discovered that the great filter, the thing that most advanced civilizations can't get beyond, is how bio-chauvinistic they are or not. And that there's two ways you can go with this story, and it's completely up to the author. So one way is the pro-chauvinism story that says that technological civilizations that got very liberal about who counts as a moral patient, they all end up going extinct. They're like, oh, these robots and these shrimp and all y'all, you're all moral patients, and they fizzle out. But the real assholes who are like, no, it's just us, and you gotta, they're like the super galactic racists who are like, if you're not made out of carbon, no way. They end up they end up, like Dune.
I wrote a story on this. Have you seen my little story called "What Is It Like to Be a Bot"? It's about these robots who are.
Is this on your website?
Yeah, I think so.
I'll go look for it. Okay.
It's about these robots who are kind of silicon chauvinists, and they think they're just sort of mucky carbon stuff that isn't worthy of, that isn't elegant enough to produce this wonderful essence of consciousness and value.
Well, that's kind of what the reboot of Battlestar Galactica was about. The Cylons were like these religious fundamentalists, and they believed that they were closer to God than the meatbag humans.
They're absolutely identical to humans as far as I could see. Apart from the fact that they would do this rebirth thing in a sort of they're going to like a bath or something and then come out of it again.
They should have had philosophers working on the show. If I was on an advisor, I would say
we'd have sorted it out, wouldn't we? Yeah.
I would work out a metaphysics for them.
Well, Pete, given that we started with an idea what we were going to do, and we were just going to try this out and see if it worked, and see if indeed I could make it actually stream onto YouTube, I think we've had a pretty good conversation. I've said.
Oh, I really enjoyed that. And as usual, we covered an enormous amount of territory. Whenever we have our 1 hour conversations, we end up packing in thousands of things. I always leave with more reading recommendations than I go in with. And,
so, Rick, a request to the people who are listening. Did you enjoy that? Would you like us to do more? If so, drop us a line or maybe leave a comment saying that you would. Then if anyone can create a really nice Persuaders style intro video.
Someone should do that
with me and Pete instead of Roger Moore and Tony Curtis. That'd be really cool.
Or maybe a little like puppets. We can make little animated.
It begins with this wonderful. Who is it by? John Barry. I can't remember the name.
Yes.
This wonderful theme tune with. Yeah. I can't describe the music, but it shows the backstory of the two characters, how they grew up with the one on the mean streets of New York and the other in privileged aristocratic surroundings, and they gradually come together, and it's a really fantastic theme tune. Well, I think I'm about talked out now, so let's go and see if the judge approves of our activities for this.
We'll find out.
We'll find out.
Well, good to talk to you as always.
Absolutely. We'll talk again soon, and if people like it, we will broadcast it again.
And if they don't like it,
then we will just keep it to ourselves because they are not worthy of our gems of wisdom.
That probably won't happen.
Okay.
All right. Talk to you later.
Have a nice week, Pete. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.